Leviticus chapter 27. This is the final word of God before he gets his people up and moving and journeying to the promised land of Canaan. As you know, that's a journey that should take, around 11 days, maybe close to 2 weeks, but less than 2 weeks under normal circumstances. But given the stubbornness, given the murmuring and the complaining, the doubts of the people, the resistance of the people to the Lord all along the way, that journey that should have taken less than 2 weeks took nearly 40 years to make. But these are God's final words to the nation before they pack up and head out. And it was all about persons or possessions that were going to be vowed or dedicated or devoted to the Lord. The major lesson that we're going to learn here, of course, is that when we vow something to the Lord, he takes that really seriously. And then in return, he expects us to take that seriously. Anytime we're dealing with the topic of vows or promises to God, some of those simple things you say, Lord, if you get me out of this mess, I promise you, here's what I'm going to do. Or Lord, if this works out in my favor, I promise you I'm going to be in church more. All of those vows that we make to the Lord, he is listening. And the writer of Ecclesiastes, the wise King Solomon, tells us in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 5, it is better not to vow at all to the Lord than to make a vow to the Lord and then not pay that vow. So if you know you're not going to do it, or if you're not 150% sure that you're going to do it, don't ever make that promise to the Lord. But in Leviticus chapter 27, it's not just about that. It's also about there being a decorum to this making of vows and giving of people and possessions to dedication to the Lord. It's about there needing to be a proper system for which all of this should take place, and that is exactly what the Lord comes up with in Leviticus chapter 27. It is a system whereby the people are able to dedicate the things that they want to dedicate to the Lord. And let's take a look at what that looks like. Verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man consecrates or dedicates by a vow certain persons to the Lord, according to your valuation, and let's stop right there for a moment. As I stated, this whole chapter is about vows or dedications to the Lord, and verses 1 and 2 get us started with what this is going to look like, how this is going to play out if a person is to dedicate themselves to the service of the Lord or dedicate one of their children to the Lord. The chapter will go on to cover all of those other possibilities, all of those other things, anything and everything just about that you could think of that you could dedicate to the Lord. You're going to find some reference to it in this chapter or something you can relate to it as a guideline. But for right now, we begin with the dedication of individuals to the Lord. And nothing in this chapter is mandatory. None of this is required. The Lord doesn't say, do this, but this is an option that is on the table for the nation that they can bring their voluntary, free will items or even persons to be dedicated to the Lord for his purposes. Now, usually the way that the dedication of items work is pretty straightforward. If you bring something and you dedicate it to the Lord, that is his. And it's not to be used for any other purpose. The Lord puts his stamp of holy to the Lord on that item or that person that you brought, or if it's you yourself, that item is stamped holy to the Lord, and that means this is no longer to be used for any other purpose. We studied that with the vessels and the items inside the tabernacle. Once those things were consecrated for God's use, that's all they were good for. And that's the straightforward look at things that are dedicated to the Lord. Now, I know this is a terrible example, but it makes the point, so I'll say it. I have footwear that is specifically dedicated to the chicken coop. And I have footwear that is specifically dedicated to ministry, and I don't mix the two up for obvious reasons. There's footwear that you wear in the chicken coop, and you don't want to wear those anywhere else. Not in public, certainly not up here on the stage. Those items are separated out for their intended and dedicated use. And so is the case with things that are dedicated to the Lord. They're never to be mixed up and used for multiple purposes. And that worked perfectly with items that were being brought to be dedicated to the Lord, if those items were items that could be used in the tabernacle sanctuary. If it was stuff that fit in perfectly with the system that the Lord had in place, no problem. You could dedicate those items, the priest would take them, they're now a part of the temple. Obviously, the bringing of clean animals to dedicate to the Lord, that would be a pretty straightforward case of dedication. Clean animals, they can be sacrificed, they can be eaten by the priest, food for the priest. So if you bring a clean animal, it's clear-cut. It's straightforward. That animal now belongs to the tabernacle, and the priests get to benefit from that. But what about all those other items? Let's just focus on people for a moment, because the same is true for people. If a person felt personally motivated to dedicate their lives to the Lord, Lord, I just love you, and there's nothing in this life that I care more about, so I want to dedicate my life to you. I want to work for you. That is a wonderful gesture to be honored and applauded. But the only problem is, are you a Levite? Because if you're not a Levite, it's just not something you can do. You can't say, hey, I feel like I just want to give everything to the Lord, so I'm here to apply for a job at the tabernacle. Are you a Levite? No. Are you trying to dedicate that fourth child of yours to the Lord? Well, is that child a Levite? If not, that child, or you as an individual, you can't partake in that aspect of that dedication. You can't be consecrated to the work. Now, there are some rare exceptions to this. As we're going to see in this chapter, everything that is brought as a matter of dedication to the Lord, it kind of falls back to the priests and how they want to handle it. If the items that are brought are beneficial either in the tabernacle sanctuary or to the priest personally for their own home lives, then that was something that the priest could accept straight up. You dedicated that to the Lord, it now belongs to the Lord's workers. But as far as a person goes, we all know you had to be born a descendant of Levi. So if as an individual you wanted to dedicate yourself to the Lord, but that was not your lineage, you weren't a descendant of Levi, you had a very slim chance that the priest may say, no, we do have a role for you, not in one of those approved acts of tabernacle service, but we do have a role for you. I can think of David using even Gentile workers for aspects of tabernacle service. And I can think of one other situation in the Bible where it was the case where a person was dedicated to the Lord, not being a descendant of Levi, and they were taken by the priest and used in the temple. Do you know who that was? Samuel. That was Samuel. And there's a reason why that happened, because Hannah, who was barren, she prayed that prayer to the Lord in the audience of Eli, the high priest, and her prayer was this: Lord, if you'll give me a child, I will dedicate that child to you for all of his days. And Eli, the high priest, he heard that prayer. And the Bible says he marked her words. That means he was paying attention. So in about 2 years, when that child was born and then weaned, and all of a sudden, here's Hannah with that baby, Eli knows, it clicks. The Lord answered that prayer. That means the Lord wants that child to be taken and dedicated to his service. So they took that child. They took Samuel at that young age, and we know that panned out. Eli did the right thing. The Lord wanted that to happen. Samuel ends up being an incredibly powerful and prominent prophet in the Old Testament. But that was a rare occasion. So for a person to want to be dedicated to the Lord and not have the descendancy of Levite, I would say 99.9999% of the time, it just couldn't happen. And here's what they would do. they would let those people come forward with the desires of their hearts. Hey, I want to be dedicated to the Lord. I just want to give my whole life to him. And what they would allow to take place, based on verses 1 and 2, they would allow those individuals to be valued. In other words, you're calculating the value of what that person would be worth as an individual in tabernacle ministry. And then what they could do is they could give the equivalent value of the labor they would add to the tabernacle. They could give that value, and it would be something then that the priest could actually use. It would be something practical for the priest. They could always use money. They could invest that money in the things of the tabernacle service. So basically, the things that you couldn't just straight up dedicate and have them exchange hands from yours to the priest, then those things were considered symbolic dedications. You paid the price for whatever value that would have added to the Lord. You pay that money in its place. You keep that item, or if it's an individual, you keep your life, or your fourth child's life. You keep that, but you have the wonderful privilege of considering yourself to be symbolically dedicated to the Lord. Redeemed, bought back, but symbolically dedicated to the Lord. So here's how you figure out the valuation of what a person would be worth in the ministry. Verse 3, if your valuation is of a male from 20 years old up to 60 years old, then your valuation shall be 50 shekels of silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. Verse 4, if it is a female, then your valuation shall be 30 shekels. Verse 5, and if from 5 years old up to 20 years old, then your valuation for a male shall be 20 shekels, and for a female 10 shekels. Verse 6, and if from a month old up to 5 years old, then your valuation for a male shall be 5 shekels of silver, and for a female your valuation shall be 3 shekels of silver. Verse 7, and if from 60 years old and above it is a male, then your valuation shall be 15 shekels, and for a female 10 shekels. Let's just talk about the elephant in the room. Something you'll all notice. What is it? Females were valued at less in every age group. The men were worth more, and the women were worth less. Boy, that's a bad way to say that. Men, just bask in that for a moment, if you like that, because I'm about to take it away. We got to be careful. Why do you think this was the case, that females were valued at less than males? Husbands, be very careful how you answer that question. Your evening and perhaps the rest of your life may depend on your words. It's real simple. What is a valuation? A valuation is a determined value. In this case, a valuation is an evaluation of what something is worth based on the use. So, yes, it is saying that females are not worth as much as males in this case for this purpose, but before you get offended, please consider how the work of the ministry was evaluated, because that's what this is based on. How much value could a female worker add to the tabernacle service, as opposed to how much value a male could add to tabernacle service? Now, keep in mind, this is going to be a traveling congregation. They're worshiping in a giant tent. It's a tabernacle. That's what it means, tent. They're worshiping in a giant tabernacle. God made everything to be suited for transport. This congregation, they don't realize it yet, but for 40 years, they're going to be on the move, and every time they move from location to location, they got to do setup and tear down of the tabernacle. And they don't have vehicles, and they're not allowed to use animals to pull those items in carts. All of it has to be what? Borne on the shoulders of the priest. It all has to be carried. So if you're looking at what that male could do if he were allowed to be a part of tabernacle service, well, he could do quite a lot. Remember some of those components in the tabernacle structure? How about just the inner tabernacle structure itself. Those were wood planks that were gold-plated. So you're not just carrying wooden planks through the desert. By foot and by hand, you're carrying gold-plated wooden planks. The Ark of the Covenant, wooden and gold-plated. The lampstand, solid gold. Table of showbread, wooden, covered with gold. You've got heavy items. The tarps themselves, the skins, those giant skins that cover the whole structure, would need to be rolled up and carried. All of that is very heavy. So the valuation of what you could add to tabernacle service factors that in. And based on that statement, the Lord is saying, not that a male is worth more than a woman, but a male owes more to the tabernacle because he can do more for the tabernacle. God made the woman physically the weaker vessel. He made the man with a stronger back, stronger arms and shoulders, so that the man could take quite a bit more abuse and be A-okay. Here's a good example. Not too long ago, when Tammy was relocating from old house to new house, she needed a piano moved. Guess what? She didn't call Melanie and Shirley and Megan to move that piano. Who did she ask to move that piano? We men, right? And the females didn't have a problem with it then. You know, that the males, for that aspect, the heavy-duty work, the males are just of a little more value because of the inherent strength of the male body. So if you don't have a problem with it there, don't have a problem with it here. The Lord is basing this on what a person can do for the Lord in tabernacle service. It's just flat out true that a male could do quite a bit more and be quite a bit more useful, so he has to make up for that with a higher valuation as he's buying back his own life that's dedicated to the Lord. That, and only that, explains why males are valued above women here. And you'll notice that trickles out by age group. Those not within the 20 to 60 age group, and by the way, I love that the Lord set that age at 60. Made me feel good about myself at 46 years old. I've still got quite a few years in that most valuable category of most useful for moving stuff, moving church chairs and pianos. I've still got quite a few years in that category. Those outside of that category, for obvious reasons, the older you get, the weaker the body physically gets. I'm already experiencing that. And those under that age group of 20, same thing. They're not able to carry as heavy of a load, so they would not be as beneficial. There's still benefit there, but not as beneficial of those in that prime age range of masculine strength. So, if I haven't offended you yet and you're ready to move on, let's do that. This is a great example of why it's so important to know the Bible, because I've heard this passage used on multiple occasions by people who are being critical of the Bible and referring to God as chauvinistic or sexist or biased or whatever. I've even heard people say God hates women, and they pointed back to this verse to prove it. It's not about that at all. It's about God being very practical. You know, by studying through the Scriptures with me, that if anything, the Lord gives special privileges and protections to the woman. He even assigns the man to be the protector and the provider for the woman because she is the physically weaker person, gender, I should say. So if you study with us, you know there's that, if anything, special privilege and provision provided for to the female gender, and I've never heard a single man have a problem with that. Not one. And for years and years until modern times, when people would read verses 1 through 7, no one would bat an eyelash at it. But for some reason, we've entered this phase of life where we're constantly looking, not us, but the world, constantly looking to call everything unfair, unequal, and sexist, and racist, and all that. We're always looking to attack those differences, and we avoid just acknowledging those differences and then living our lives according to those differences. And I love that the Bible keeps us rooted to that. The church, we're not going to get caught up in all that, looking for sexism and racism around every corner. We're not going to get caught up on that. We're going to recognize God did create us differently. And so some things are handled differently between us. There are special considerations between the genders, and that's A-okay. God made it that way. Verse 8, but if he is too poor to pay your valuation, then he shall present himself before the priest, and the priest shall set a value for him according to the ability of him who vowed. The priest shall value him. So this is a very gracious provision that the Lord put in place for the poor so that the poor could also participate in this dedication of persons and possessions to the Lord. You wouldn't let price be the issue. And it would be a terrible look on the whole system if there were people running around in Canaan and eventually Israel and saying, man, I'd love to be dedicated to the Lord. Or I'd love to dedicate some of my possessions or even my house or whatever to the Lord, but I can't afford it. The price is too high. That'd be a terrible look. But no, the Lord takes that into account. And even if you don't have 2 shekels to rub together, if you got the 1 shekel, then the Lord's going to come down to your price, what you can afford, what you can do through your financial ability, and he's going to say, bring it. I'll let you participate. I'll let you dedicate those things to me, and I'll cut you a good deal because of your financial condition. Verse 9, if it is an animal that men may bring as an offering to the Lord, in other words, if it is a clean animal that could be used in the tabernacle offerings, all that anyone gives to the Lord shall be holy. So if it's a clean animal, once you dedicate that to the Lord, it's the Lord's. That can be directly used by the priest. They're going to offer that thing up to the Lord. They're going to chow down. They're going to have a good meal. You've provided food for the priest. The Lord can use that, so you're not getting it back. Verse 10, he shall not substitute it or exchange it, good for bad or bad for good. And if he at all exchanges animal for animal, then both it and the one exchanged for it shall be holy. So verse 10 tells us that you were not allowed to downgrade your dedication of a clean animal, nor were you allowed to upgrade that dedication of a clean animal. This was in order to prevent you from having a change of heart, and you can see where that might take place. If someone has you've heard of buyer's remorse, right? This is giver's remorse. You bring your best cow, your best heifer to the Lord. Lord, I just love you so much. You blessed me so much. You give me so much. Here's my best heifer. And then a few days later, you're like, boy, I regret that. I regret giving that good heifer. So Lord, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you one in the mid-range quality, slightly defective. One of those, like the garments you buy that you used to buy at Gabe's. You remember that? Everything you buy at Gabe's had the slightly imperfect tab on it. I'm going to give you this slightly imperfect heifer, and I'm going to exchange that for the good one, the really good one that I gave you. That's a really bad statement to make to the Lord. You're saying, Lord, I thought for a while you were worthy of the best, but I changed my mind, and I'll give you about half of what I got. I'll give you something of lesser value. Contrariwise, the one you wouldn't expect is that you couldn't upgrade your offering. You brought that mid-range, mid-level value heifer, and you just get that urge. No, I want to do more. That's not enough. And the Lord says, let's not get into that whole thing of exchanging, but let's just do this on a case-by-case basis. If you gave that somewhat decent quality animal or even a bad quality animal or possession, the Lord is saying, don't do any exchanges whatsoever. And if you're going to push for that exchange, the Lord's going to consider it to be 2 separate dedications. Verse 11, this is now laws regarding the dedication of unclean animals to the Lord. Verse 11, if it is an unclean animal which they do not offer as a sacrifice to the Lord, that is, they cannot use unclean animals in tabernacle services, then in that case he shall present the animal before the priest, and the priest shall set a value for it, whether it is good or bad. As you, the priest, value it, so it shall be. Verse 13, but if he wants to redeem it, then he must add 1/5 to your valuation. So clean animals could not be redeemed because they could be used, and it could be provision of food for the priests. But unclean animals, on the other hand, they were unkosher. They could not be eaten. They could not be used. So those could be redeemed at any time by the people that brought those and dedicated to the Lord, because they'd always be there. They're not going to kill those and eat those. So someone might say, Lord, I love you so much. I want to bless you, so I'm going to dedicate this donkey to you. The only problem is, what is the Lord going to do with the donkey? You can't strap a cart to that thing and haul tabernacle materials. Can't sacrifice a donkey. Sheep, oxen, sure, those are clean animals. You could do that. Can't sacrifice a donkey. You can't use it for anything else in tabernacle ministry, but you did always have that option that a priest might say, you know, I could use a donkey at home. I could use a donkey that could pull my yard cart and help me with the yard work, so I'll take that straight up. That's a direct, dedicated thing to the Lord. I'll take that, and if you want to redeem it back later, you can. But in general, the way this worked was that the Lord would have no use for those things that did not directly relate to temple services, tabernacle services. So what they had to do was they had to do that whole symbolic thing, right? They had to bring that animal. Here's my donkey. You kind of conceal the fact that it's a stubborn donkey. You're hoping they go for it, but the priests take a look at it, and they don't go for it. They say, no, we've got no use for that. So they set a value for that animal. Here's what that animal is worth. If we could use that, here's about what the value would be. And then you add 20%. This is like a redemption surcharge. You're going to pay now 120% to take that animal back. You've exchanged the equivalent value of what you wanted to dedicate to the Lord. So the Lord got his cut in a usable form, money. You get that animal back, and symbolically, it is dedicated to the Lord. Verse 14, and when a man dedicates his house to be holy to the Lord, Lord, I want to dedicate my whole house to you for your service. This is now a ministry house. Well, then the priest shall set a value for it, whether it is good or bad, so high market value or low market value. As the priest values it, so it shall stand. Verse 15, if he who dedicated it wants to redeem his house, then he must add 1/5, that's 20%, so he'll be paying back a total of 120% of that market value to redeem it. And then, as the scripture says, verse 15, it shall be his. So with the dedication of a home to the Lord, you did have the option of lending out that house, and the priest could use it. But you do got to remember that homes always reverted back to the original owner at what? At the year of Jubilee. So this was something that when you're making these valuations, you have to go by the date of the sale, which is leasing, technically. You go by the date of the sale in proximity to the year of Jubilee, and that's how you figure out the value for it. And again, you didn't have to wait for the year of Jubilee to give it back. Even though you dedicated it to the Lord, you could buy that back at any time because the Lord does want you to have your property. But in order to discourage that kind of thing, because it feels like, pardon the expression, being an Indian giver. Have you ever heard that? I know that might sound racist, but I'm not being racist. It's just a well-established statement. I don't know how else to say it. The Lord wants to prevent people from being Indian givers. Here's my house, Lord, I dedicate it to you. Nah, you know what? Changed my mind. I forgot I didn't get another place to live. I need that back. So to discourage that, there's that surcharge of 20%, 120%. You give that house to the Lord, it was worth $100,000. Now to get it back, you owe the Lord $120,000. That's a bad deal. See, that's gonna cause you to think twice about taking back a house that's dedicated to the Lord or offering it up in the first place. Again, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 5, better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Verse 16, if a man dedicates to the Lord part of a field of his possession. Now, I know this gets really difficult to understand. I'm going to try to help you out the best I can. But just remember this, priests were not allowed to own land, so you're not going to read a section in here about people dedicating their land to the work of the Lord, to the priest. But you will read about portions of fields from their land. And what that's talking about is not talking about the sale of actual land. You're not selling off a chunk of your land here. When it talks about these portions of fields, what it's talking about is it's talking about a portion of crop field. We're going to see that in the next verse. It's part of the valuation for this. So here's what that might look like. It actually would be a great opportunity for a landowner that was also a farmer. He might say, you know, the Lord has blessed us. We have 100 acres where we're growing grain, 80 acres of grain. That's way more than enough for us. Why don't we do this? Why don't we take that one section, that portion of our field, why don't we give 20 acres of that crop and dedicate that to the Lord? In other words, anything that grows on that section of 20 acres, that's going to be food for the priest. We can bless the Lord with that portion of our field. So that's what's being talked about here, not the exchange of a land sale, which would be illegal for the priest, but this is actually the dedication of a portion of field and its crops. It's the crops, not the field itself. Did I make myself clear there, or did I confuse you more? All right. So great option for landowners. Verse 16, if a man dedicates to the Lord part of a field of his possession, then your valuation shall be according to the seed for it. A homer of barley seed shall be valued at 50 shekels of silver. So the value of that portion of field that was being dedicated was dependent upon the amount of seed that was being planted on it. That makes sense. Verse 17, if he dedicates his field from the year of Jubilee, according to your valuation, it shall stand. Verse 18, but if he dedicates his field after the Jubilee, then the priest shall reckon to him the money due according to the years that remain till the year of Jubilee, and it shall be deducted from your valuation. That's once again telling us that you have to factor in the date of that sale with the proximity of that date to the year of Jubilee in order to get an adjusted market value. Verse 19, and if he who dedicates the field ever wishes to redeem it, then he must add 1/5, 20%. He's going to pay 120% now of the money of your valuation to it, and it shall belong to him. Verse 20, but if he does not want to redeem the field, that is, if he wants to just say, you know what, forever, indefinitely, permanently, that 20 acres of our crop field, we're going to give that to the Lord, then he could do that. He could say, we never want that back. Even at the year of Jubilee, we never want it back. We're just going to give it right back. That's always going to be in order to take care of the priests and the work of the Lord. A person could do that, reading on, or if he has sold the field to another man, it shall not be redeemed anymore, verse 21, but the field, when it is released in the Jubilee, shall be holy to the Lord as a devoted field. It shall be the possession of the priest. And again, that's not a land possession. That is the possession of any crops that would grow in that section of the field that was dedicated. So if a man didn't want it back, he could give that permanently to the priest. But if he tried to pull a fast one on the Lord and dedicate that to the Lord and then sell that property off to someone else, buddy, sorry, you're stuck with that. I dedicated 20% of that land to the priest. You're stuck with that. You got to honor that commitment. It's kind of like almost like a fraud scenario, because he's giving that value, and now he's selling that off to someone. He's trying to break even on the overall money purchase of it. And the Lord says, if that's the case, if someone's trying to do something like that, that's a little bit maybe perhaps on the shady or unethical side, the Lord says, nope, you know what? If someone's going to do something like that, they're going to lose that property permanently, and it's going to permanently belong to the priest. That is the crops of that property. Verse 22, and if a man dedicates to the Lord a field which he has bought, which is not the field of his possession. You know what that means, right? He's not the original owner of this land. He bought this land from someone else, and now he wants to offer this land up to the Lord, to dedicate it to the Lord. There's a little bit of an issue there. What is that? Again, year of Jubilee. When the year of Jubilee rolls around, that's going to revert back to the original owner. This new owner now, he's wanting to dedicate this to the Lord. That presents a bit of a complexity. So here's what the Lord says, verse 23. Then the priest shall reckon to him the worth of your valuation up to the year of Jubilee, And he shall give your valuation on that day as a holy offering to the Lord. Verse 24, in the year of Jubilee, the field shall return to, who do you guess? The new owner or the original? The original, right. It shall return to him from whom it was bought, to the one who owned the land as a possession, to the original owner. Makes sense, right? The Lord's not going to lose track of records here. He's going to make sure everyone gets their fair shake in all of this. Verse 25, and all your valuation shall be according to the shekel of the sanctuary. That's the approved currency. 20 gerahs to the shekel, and that's the approved currency rate. Verse 26, but the firstborn of the animals, which should be, in other words, which are rightly supposed to be the Lord's firstborn, no man shall dedicate, whether it is an ox or sheep, it is the Lord's. So you couldn't try to kill two birds with one stone. You couldn't say, all right, our heifer just gave birth, so it's the firstborn. That firstborn belongs to the Lord, so I got to take that animal and I've got to give that to the Lord. But you know what? I'd like to come off looking really good here. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to take that animal and pass that off as if I'm dedicating that animal to the Lord. Because I get spiritual credits for doing that. People will think highly of me. And truly, that would be something you could get away with, because it's not like the priests were assigned to keep track of all the animals out there that gave birth in the nation. They wouldn't know if this was the firstborn of your animal. So you could bring that, and really it was an obligatory offering. It was a required offering. You had to give it, but you kind of pulled this fast one to make it look like you were voluntarily giving it to get the spiritual credits and to get the applause from people. And the Lord doesn't like that a bit, not at all. He doesn't want us to be mixing those offerings, trying to kill two birds with one stone. For that matter, those firstborn animals, they couldn't be used for any other sin offering, trespass offering. If you wanted to make a dedication offering, you couldn't pass that off and mix that up with any of those other offerings. The Lord is simply saying all of that needs to stay separate. What you owe, so you pay. And what you want to bring voluntarily, then you bring that voluntarily. Keep it all in its proper place, and that's going to be the place of blessing for you. It really is a shame the Lord has to spell this kind of stuff out for us, but we are descendants of Adam. We are fallen, and we are fault-filled. So the Lord has to spell some of these things out. Hey, let's keep this thing legit. Keep this system to a manner that honors me. Verse 27, and if it is an unclean animal, then he shall redeem it according to your valuation, and shall add 1/5 to it. Or if it is not redeemed, then it shall be sold according to your valuation. And hopefully you're kind of catching on to what's happening here, because once you get the basics down, you just apply those basics to everything, and then you pick apart the exceptions that are added based on those individual specifics for each situation or category of dedication. Verse 28, nevertheless, no devoted offering that a man may devote to the Lord of all that he has, both man and beast, or the field of his possession, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted offering is most holy to the Lord. So back to that reminder of those things that are devoted to the Lord, that can be used straight up as a direct, dedicated item or person to the Lord. You're not getting those back. They're devoted to the Lord. Furthermore, this would spill over into the category of if a priest or a prophet or a king would declare something to be devoted to the Lord, then that's what it was. And there was no going back on that. If a prophet, priest, or king said, this land or this home or this field of cows belong to the Lord, devoted to the Lord, then for you to try to own that or purchase that or sell that would be a direct violation and grieve the heart of God. A good example of that is the story of Achan. You remember the story of Achan? Well, Joshua, the prophet of the nation, the successor of Moses, he had made that announcement. All of the spoils of Ai, they're devoted to the Lord. And what does Achan do? He goes out and he takes those devoted things. He steals some things that really caught his eye, and he was intending to keep those as his own possession. He was taking the devoted things, one of the very things that the Lord said wouldn't happen here. And of course, the Lord made him pay for that, right? It ended up costing him his life. Verse 28, the Lord's pretty serious about it. Verse 29, no person under the ban who may become doomed to destruction among men shall be redeemed, but shall surely be put to death. What does that mean? That means that you could not buy someone out of a death sentence. If they had committed a crime worthy of execution, and that was the verdict, you couldn't say, well, let me redeem that person back. Let me buy that person back. Nope, not going to happen. It's just a matter of good justice in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 30. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, it is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. 31. If a man wants at all to redeem any of his tithes, he shall add 1/5 to it. So in modern times, it might look like this. Lord, I owe you $300 in tithes this month. I can only give you $200 right now. But what I'll do, Lord, is I'll give you that other $100 next month. And the Lord says, well, if you're going to do that, we're going to add a surcharge to that as well. I'm going to charge you interest for what you're not paying up in tithes. Now, in their day, that would look like, grain, so many measurements of grain that were owed to the Lord and not immediately paid up. That would come due with an interest added to it. And you might ask the question, now, we studied this. The Lord wanted nothing to do with the Jews charging one another interest. He didn't want them doing that. But here the Lord is charging the people interest. Why is he doing that? Is it a double standard? No. As is in every one of these cases, when the Lord is adding a surcharge, what he's trying to do is discourage the behavior. So in this case, he's trying to discourage the present delay of paying your tithes with the intention of the future promise of getting that to the Lord. He wants to try to discourage that from becoming a habit in your life. Because you know how that works, don't you? If you can't pay your tithes this month, what happens next month? You're further in the hole. And then the next month after that, you're further in the hole. And what do you eventually got to do? You eventually got to say, Lord, can I get a clean start? I know I said I was going to get this to you. I just can't swing it. So the Lord would want to discourage us from getting into that cycle. On one hand, I love this because it shows that the Lord is willing to work with us in situations like that. Lord, I don't have it. Okay, get it to me next month. Add 20%. It shows us that God is willing to work with us in our difficult financial situations, but it also shows us that the Lord cares enough about us to try to keep us from getting stuck in those perpetual negative cycles that could drag us down financially. Verse 32, and concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock or whatever passes under the rod, the 10th one shall be holy to the Lord, and he shall not require whether it is good. He shall not inquire whether it is good or bad, nor shall he exchange it. And if he exchanges it at all, then both it and the one exchanged for it shall be holy. So it's not really an exchange at all. You've just sacrificed another one. It shall not be redeemed. So animals passing under the rod, what does that mean? We got one more verse to do. This is awesome. What does animals passing under the rod mean? Again, this is another really bad statement about the natural corruption that exists within the heart of mankind. The Lord knows it's going to be our natural propensity to try to pay our tithes in this case in a way that benefits us. So if you owe the Lord, let's keep ourselves in the olden days here. Let's keep ourselves in their situation with our example. If you owed the Lord 10% of your cattle, what does the human flesh by nature tell you to do? It tells you to take the Lord's 10% and give the Lord the weak ones, maybe the dying ones, the defective ones. It's that natural temptation within us to use the tithe, in this case, as our own personal animal disposal service. Well, there's 10% that we don't want anyway. They're good for nothing. Let's give them to the Lord. The Lord doesn't want you to give him stuff that you're too good for. I mean, if you're too good for it, Why would you think the Lord would want it, right? We've said this before. The Lord doesn't want your junk. Don't bring your junk and, well, here's this chair, 3 broken legs, but the one's still good. I'm sure it can be fixed and used, so here, take it for the church. Give it to the poor. That's just ugly, right? That's an ugly heart. And the Lord knew that was the kind of stuff we would do. So he set up this system. It's called passing under the rod. What you do is you funnel your animals through a narrow gateway, and then you have 2 branch out sections for them, and you have a rod over the top of that little fenced-in area, and you make all your animals pass under that rod. And when they pass under that rod, you count them, and here's what you do. It's not the first 9 are yours, and then that 10th one is God's, right? What does God get? First fruits. He gets the first. So cow number 1, as it passes under the rod, filter that off to the right. That's the Lord's. The next 9, count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Filter them off to the left. Those are mine. The 11th cow coming under the rod, passing under the rod. Filter that off to the right. That's the Lord. The next 9, those are mine. So that's how you do it, because that lets the giving of your tithe in the tithing of livestock, it lets it be random, or, and I like this, or it lets God choose whether he wants to get involved and personally select, handpicked the animals that he's going to take as your 10%. Verse 34. These are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses for the children of Israel on Mount Sinai. And now they are ready to move. And we are ready to move to the next book. Because if you'll look, what comes after Leviticus chapter 27? Not Leviticus chapter 28. Does anyone have Leviticus chapter 28 in their Bible? Mine doesn't. I just want to make sure. Okay, so we have finished Leviticus chapter 27. We have finished our study chapter by chapter through the book of Leviticus. You are to be commended for surviving it. Here's my applaud for you. I applaud you for surviving. You survived a chapter by chapter, verse by verse study through Leviticus. You can survive all the rest of them. It's all downhill from here. We did the tough stuff, Leviticus. So let's give the Lord a hand clap of praise. Let's stand to our feet and close in a word of prayer.